Hello, everyone. Welcome to Yeosijae Global Future Dialogue. I'm Jaeho Yeom, Emeritus Professor of Korea University and a Director of the Board of Yeosijae Future Consensus Institute. Before we start, we have a very interesting and very important webinar today, and inviting Professor Yeosijae, and we will discuss the future world leadership and more foreign policy and that kind of things. But before we start, I would like to inform you that there is a simultaneous interpretation available for the Zoom webinar. As there are many Korean audiences, please excuse me. Let me address this information in Korean again. 본 웨비나는 영어로 진행되지만 한국어 동시 통역이 진행되고 있습니다.
Today's webinar will be proceeded with English. However, since there are many Korean members of the audience, please use the simultaneous interpretation service by using the globe icon on your page.
Let's go back to our start. The 21st century, we are just facing the great transformation of human culture, and everything is changing very rapidly. But the COVID-19 outbreak is just to accelerate the trends and speed of the great transformation. Given that COVID-19 outbreak has brought about broad and profound changes across the world, we have launched a series of research projects to examine the challenges caused by the outbreak and seek solutions for a better future. Especially this Yeosijae Global Future Dialogue series is designed to put together invaluable insights from experts around the world. Today's webinar is titled A Moral Foreign Policy and 2020 U.S. Presidential Election. This is our 6th webinar of Global Future Dialogue series. Today, world-famous Professor Yeosijae is going to discuss his new book, Do Morals Matter, subtitled Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, and predict the direction of U.S. foreign policy after the 2020 presidential election. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Yeosijae. As you know, that Yeosijae is a University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and a Deputy Undersecretary of State, and won Distinguished Services Awards from all 3 agencies. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was ranked as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy. And in 2011, Foreign Policy, the famous journal, named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. He has published a number of books, including Soft Power and today's book, Do Morals Matters. Before we start, I would like to introduce our housekeeping rules for today's webinar. First, Professor Nai will have 10 minutes keynote speech before the discussion. Second, during the webinar, please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the Q&A box at the bottom center of your page. I will deliver those questions to Professor Nai during our Q&A session. Third, after the event, the full record of this webinar will be uploaded on our website. I look forward to learning from Professor Nai about the influence of U.S. presidents' moral views on foreign policy. And I've read your book, the recent book, Do Morals Matter, and it is a well-covered modern foreign policy history of the United States. And I just want to have 10 minutes, your preliminary, and starting just a speech for our discussion. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yeom, and it's a pleasure to be with the Yeosijae Institute. Sometimes people ask, why was it I wrote a book about morals? Because many people argue that in international politics, morals don't matter. They say that it's only the national interest that matters. I remember once I was working with a French diplomat, and I asked him, we ever worried about the moral implications of the issues we dealt with? He said, no, the only thing, morals don't matter. The only thing that matters is the interests of France. And I don't think he even realized what a profound moral judgment he just made when he made that statement. Very often people will say, it's national interests that determine everything. And they bake the cake, so to speak, and then political leaders come along and they sprinkle a little morality on the top like icing to make the cake look pretty. But I would argue, and I try to prove this in the book, that in fact, the moral views of leaders often make a big difference. One example of this has a very strong impact on Korea is Harry Truman. In 1950, when it looked like the Korean War would be lost after China intervened, General MacArthur said that if Truman would allow him to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese, he would win the war. And Truman said no, he was not going to kill that many women and children. And that moral view of Truman's was profoundly important. So that's an example where morals did matter. Now, most events in world politics are not as dramatic as that, but it is interesting when people try to talk about morals, at least in the United States, they often simply argue that if you say good things, then you're moral. But that's not enough. For example, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, his press secretary said, you had to admire the moral clarity of his freedom agenda. But if you think about it, the net effect of the invasion of Iraq was very bad. It had terrible consequences. So the fact that you have good intentions is not enough to justify the bad consequences. So I argue in the book that you really have to look at three dimensions to be able to judge a moral foreign policy. One is the intentions or the motives of the leader. A second is the means that are used. And the third is the consequences, and particularly whether the leader paid attention to possible unintended consequences that could have immoral results. And that way, what I did was look over the 14 presidents who we've seen in the United States since 1945, and came to judgments about how they scored on all three dimensions. I found that Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, came out in the top division. And the bottom was the Lyndon Johnson because of the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon, George W. Bush, the second President Bush because of the Iraq War, and Donald Trump, our current president. In fact, what's interesting is that Trump is probably the most amoral president that we've had in the 14 presidents we've seen since 1945. So what I tried to show in the book is that leaders do matter, that whether a president has moral or immoral concerns can make a big difference in history, and that right now we're going through, I think, a relatively low point in the United States in terms of Trump's approach to foreign policy. But we'll have to see what happens if there's a change in the American elections in November. So let me stop there and throw it open to your questions and the questions of the audience, because there are many interesting topics to discuss that I've only begun to touch upon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it is a marvelous presentation. And you emphasized that you evaluated the 14 presidents after 1945. And as you mentioned, that good presidents and not the bad, but a little bit poor evaluation of the president in terms of the moral. But you have emphasized that not only the intention, but also means and consequences. And it is very important and very sort of impressive to me because many people think that, it is intention and motives is good and everything is good. Everybody thinks that kind of things. But in reality, means and the consequences are also very important. As I said before in the introductory, just a starting point, I just mentioned that now is the turn of the century, and we, humankind, are making some kind of new world order. And then now we just have the G2, the United States and China, and also somebody says that we are facing the COVID-19, we don't have any world leadership. And for example, both the United States and China, they don't just show any just world leadership in terms of to solve the COVID-19. Not only they are not that much successful in terms of their domestic measures to solve the problem. So even somebody says that not only the G0 and we don't have any leadership, world leadership, even some people says that minus G2 and it is some kind of their United States and China is hampering the world equilibrium, world security. So in terms of this kind of in this kind of situation, and I strongly agree with you in terms of the moral is very important, and also that is a basic underlying sort of ideas and sort of visions for United States foreign policy. But do you expect some kind of a new leadership in the next election, or President Trump will change his attitude or some kind of means, and we can expect some kind of consequences? How do you expect that?
Well, I agree with you that I think both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump were failed leaders when they responded to the COVID. Both of them initially were in denial. They didn't want to admit the nature of the problem. Then they tried to cover things up. Then when it was getting out of control, they tried to shift the blame onto others. And so I think it was a failure of leadership, and neither of them really took the lead internationally that was needed. So I agree with you on your diagnosis. The interesting question, I think, will be if the United States were to have a change in November, if President Trump is replaced by Joe Biden, would Biden take a more forthcoming leadership position? And I've often argued that the United States should take a position like it took in Europe with regard to the Marshall Plan. It should say that I would hope President Biden might say, we will devote a certain portion of our vaccines to helping poor people in poor countries. And the Marshall Plan, the United States devoted up to 4% of its gross domestic product to help European countries recover. That was good for the US, but it was good for Europe as well. If the United States were to take, let's say, 20% of its vaccines and to make sure that they went to poor countries with inadequate health systems, particularly to health providers, that would be good for those poor countries, but it would be good for us as well. That's what I mean about real leadership. The moral issue comes not in defending the national interest, it's how you define the national interest. Do you define it broadly, as in the Marshall Plan example, or do you define it narrowly, as in the way President Trump does with his very narrow transactional approach? So I'm hoping that we'll see a change in leadership, and that that may lead to a better leadership on the issue of the COVID pandemic as well.
Mm-hmm. Good. As you mentioned that in your book as well, and the Marshall Plan is a very important measure after the 1945 for recovering the European countries. And as you mentioned, there is a very interesting idea, and the United States will take the step to just provide some kind of vaccines to European countries or the poor countries. It is a very good leadership, and we can just trust that kind of thing. And also, you have spread some kind of liberal democracy as an idea for the world, society. And in addition to that, this kind of aids and subsidies for the world, prosperity. It is good thing. So you are not alone, and you just collaborate with other partners and the friends together. So that was the reason why you become a leader in the world order. But now, just President Trump, focus on the national interest only for the domestic politics. And also, I understand that you are just competing with China as an Asian country, but too much just a push and aggressive the threat to China will not be a very a fruitful outcome, or especially for the world safety and that kind of things. So, but in terms of this, as you mentioned that when I learned at Stanford in political science, and we've read the Essence of Decision, and I learned a lot the Cuban Missile Crisis, and John F. Kennedy allow his younger brother Bob Kennedy to play the role as a devil's advocate. At that time, Robert Kennedy strongly argued that the United States is different from other countries. We cannot just atomic bomb or that kind of things, and the threat or direct attack is not necessary, and because we are different from other countries, and we are different from Winston Churchill or some other leaders. So the moral issues are very important for next administration. Is there any this kind of devil's advocate in the Security Council, or the kind of, as you, just like you, the intellectuals can strongly play the role of the devil's advocate for the world peace and world security for the 21st century?
Well, I think you will see with the Biden presidency, if Biden is elected, some very interesting younger people who have these broad-minded attitudes. Somebody like Anthony Blinken, who is Biden's chief foreign policy advisor and who served as Deputy Secretary of State under Obama, will probably play a major role. And he's a person of a very broad perspective who really would pay attention to moral issues. Another young person like that is Jake Sullivan, who was a chief of staff to Biden at one point, and who is a very broad-minded and thoughtful young person who would take moral issues into account. So I think there will be a generational change, and that the people who are surrounding Biden will have the kind of broad perspective that you attributed to Robert Kennedy at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm optimistic about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If Biden is elected, you have some kind of a good opportunity to have this kind of devil's advocate. How about President Trump is reelected? And is there any possibility to have that kind of devil's advocate?
Well, unfortunately, President Trump does not listen to advisors much. It's interesting to read the book written by John Bolton, The Room Where It Happened, which was his memoir of the year and a half that he served as Trump's national security advisor. And what he describes in President Trump as a man who's very self-centered, thinking only of his own narrow interests, and who doesn't pay attention to the intelligence or to the advice of his counselors. Now, Bolton was disillusioned with this, and so his book portrays Trump in a very negative way. But there are a lot of other portrayals of Trump which are consistent with that. I don't think if Trump is reelected that there's much hope that he will change at this stage in life. So I'm afraid if Trump is reelected, we have 4 more years of a lack of leadership.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And related to this issue, and because we are interested in the Asian countries, as you, in your book, you mentioned that there are 2 major shifts. The one is horizontal shift, comes from the Asian countries, and vertical shift in technology. And 2 issues are very important. And also the rivalry confront at the moment with the United States and China that is related to these 2 issues. If you are an advisor, and for the next, just the present time, and what is your advice, for example, based on your soft power or moral issues, and what can be the possible, most effective way to just make a world peace and the security, especially to work together with the Asian countries?
Well, I have argued that we should have no illusions that China is going to become a liberal society. Xi Jinping has been clamping down with tighter than ever party control. So I don't see China changing very much internally, but I think we can still influence China's external behavior by maintaining our alliances and working in multilateral institutions. So I've described the relationship between the United States and China as a cooperative rivalry. And that has 2 parts to it. You have to have cooperation and rivalry at the same time. There's some issues, for example, climate change or pandemics, which no country can solve alone. And so if we're going to deal with that, we have to have cooperation with China. And at the same time, there'll be issues which are a rivalry. For example, if China tries to pour sand on rocks and reefs in the South China Sea and call them an island with territorial seas, that's against international laws determined by the Hague Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. And so America will have to be willing to continue to sail its navy through these false claims to show that freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation still attains. But it doesn't mean it has to be a new Cold War. It doesn't mean that everything is good or everything is bad. We're going to have to learn to cooperate with China and also pursue a rivalry with China in places where each is appropriate. So I think a moral leadership for the next decade is going to have to see China in that term, not as an enemy, but as a rival, but also as a rival where in some places we will have to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as you mentioned that the climate change and pandemic issues then may be very much easier to cooperate with China and the United States. But the world international financial system or technology issues, and not to mention the military or that kind of things, and very difficult. So, as you mentioned, that the cooperative rivalry is very, very interesting, just a concept. But for the other countries, including Europe and Asian countries, we are just watching to G2 and to just make a better ground and some kind of better atmosphere, ecosystem for the world development in 21st century. So in that sense, you still believe that soft power or moral issues are important in terms of the international financial systems and also the trade issues and also the technology issues?
Yeah, soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And the ability to get cooperation among countries rests partly on attraction, the ability to persuade others and attract them. And in that sense, I don't like this G2 argument much because there is a role for others as well. For example, on issues of climate or pandemic or the financial system, Europe, when it acts as one entity, is an economy the same size as the U.S. and bigger than China. Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. And Korea, which has had an impressive success story with its economic growth, Korea has provided a very good example of the way it's responded to the COVID crisis. So even though Korea won't be as big as its neighboring countries, it has set a good example of a democracy which has handled the pandemic very well. So I think it's a mistake for us just to talk about G2 with the US and China trying to run things and everybody else sitting by the side. I think, in fact, as Europe and Korea and others take the lead in providing a good example, they are going to demonstrate soft power.
Good. Yeah. Not only just sitting aside and just watching what they're going to do, the G2 power, and we Korean, including Korean people and the Korean countries, we have to do some kind of role, for the future, world order, or just like world safety. Okay. Then let's move to the South Korean issues. And South Korean President Moon Jae-in argues for an ideal pacifism. And in terms of intention and motives, his idea, motive is some kind of moral, as you mentioned that. But in terms of means and consequences, a lot of people just think a little bit differently. So it is a very ideal pacifism rather than realism in relation to especially North Korea. Do you see that this kind of a moral approach is effective and efficient, or do you think that is there any other measures we have to consider, or do you have any advice to President Moon Jae-in?
Well, pacifism is a good example of what I mentioned earlier about something which is idealistic and sounds like it's based on very good intentions. Who could be in favor of war when peace is so much better? So yes, pacifism indicates good intentions. The question, though, is if you show that you will not fight, if you will not defend yourself, are you likely to produce pacifism in your opponents? And I don't think there's much evidence in history that that works. And if we take just the Korean Peninsula and the history of the Kim regime dynasty for 3 presidencies, I don't think they've shown much interest in pacifism. I think that their desire is to unify the Korean Peninsula under North Korean communist leadership, and then they've shown a willingness to use force to do that. So I'm afraid that if you were to let down your guard, if you were to have no military capacity and to have no alliances, you would find that the consequences would be very immoral. That unless you can show me that Kim Jong-un is in his heart a pacifist, then I think you cannot show me that the consequences of pacifism in the South would be pacifism for the peninsula as a whole. Any man who can murder his uncle and his half-brother, I don't think fits the description of a pacifist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that your position, because you evaluate President Carter one of the most moral president in terms of intention, but he also just took the very strong stance for using means and to achieve the peace or some kind of humanitarian issues. So I understand that. Another issue related to Korea and South Korea, and we have a conflict with Japan. This is the worst time between Korea and Japan, and there's a pervasive idea that South Korea is a superior in morality to Japan because of the history of Japanese colonial rule hinders South Korea from compromising with Japan. And it is almost 70 years ago. And what are your thoughts of South Korea-Japan relations that are in the worst deadlock because of the focus of the morality of past history? So how to solve these kind of things? And only the moral issue is enough to solve this kind of foreign relations?
Well, I think that here's a case where what's important for a leader is to look to the future, not to the past. If you look at Japan's record on the Korean Peninsula since 1910, it was indeed immoral. But many Japanese agree with that and believe that Japan acted badly. And when you look at the Japan today, it's not the Japan of the 1930s. It's not a military-dominated imperialist power, quite the contrary. And so if one harks back and focuses only on history, then Koreans can feel aggrieved about the past. But then you have to ask, what are the consequences of that focus? It may make you feel good in terms of intentions, but it may have bad consequences. It may mean that you're less able to deter actions by North Korea. It may mean that you provide openings for China. So I would argue that that leadership today on the Japan-Korea front should take the view of the future. What will produce the best consequences for Korean people and for the region as a whole? And in that sense, it would be to turn the other cheek, to realize that the Japan today is not the Japan of the 1930s, and to say that we're going to try to make a better world together with Japan, and not to try to drag up the evils of the history of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. You just emphasized that moral issues does not live alone in the past issues, but just we have to look forward to the future issues, and it is much better. That is related to your three-dimensional moral issues. Not only the intention, but also means and the consequences are very important. Especially, I got an impression that it's quite interesting. In the consequences, not only just the outcome, but also the educational issue you just mentioned, that is how much influence to the ordinary people, domestic people, to learn from the leadership's moral issues, and then what is the consequences of that kind of thing. It is very, very important in the history, I think. Yeah. So in terms of this, what is your comment?
Well, a political leader obviously has a role as a decision maker, but a political leader also has a role as an educator. A political leader has to explain to his people what the world is, what are the choices they face, what types of actions would be better for the long run, and try to devote attention in that direction. One of my complaints about Donald Trump is he divides the American people. He always finds ways to divide people. And it's a cheap and easy way for a political leader to get support by casting another part of the population as an enemy, or by casting other countries as an enemy. A good political leader actually should be an educator, trying to raise people's sights to a higher level. And I think that's where Trump has failed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is sad to watch that kind of things, not only in the United States, but also in China or Japan or Russia, and they just divide the people and something like that. And then in the domestic politics, they may gain, but in the international, especially world leaders, and it is so pity to just solve the world security. Okay, and one of the final question is that, okay, now in your book and the very profound and very intensive analysis of the moral issues in terms of the foreign policies, and from now on, you want to have the Biden will be reelected then. Anyway, even Biden or Trump. And what is your advice to solve the world problem, just like cybercrime and the pandemic issues? A lot of things are more complicated, and a lot of issues were coming up. And what is the role of the U.S. leaders for the world society?
Well, I think it has to be international cooperation because no country can solve these problems acting alone. The United States has to play a role as an ally to countries which would otherwise feel intimidated, for example, by China or Russia. But and that's why we have our alliance with South Korea and Japan, and we should maintain it. On the other hand, we also have to cooperate with China on issues like pandemics and issues like climate change. So if you look to the future, one of the things that Biden has said is that if he's elected, he will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords right away. And he will also stop this one-year withdrawal from the World Health Organization. In addition to that, I think we're going to have to work on revising the World Trade Organization and developing new rules for international trade. And there are a lot of other areas in which international institutions can be improved. But I think the path that we've been on under Trump, which is away from alliances and multilateralism, is the wrong path. And I think Biden has suggested that he will turn back to the path which is more consistent in American foreign policy of the 13 presidents before Trump that I study in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in your book, you also emphasize the international institutions, and United States leaders solve the world problems by way of utilizing institutions, and just like United Nations or WTO or that kind of things. And we are expecting that kind of just international institutions solve the problem with the cooperation with not only the G2 but also the China, the Japan and Korea or European countries. We work together. That is more important for the 21st century. Yeah, it is very interesting and impressive discussion. Now it's time to turn our discussion to the followers and the foreign press reporters and also the webinar watchers. And do you have any questions and comments? And please feel free to just speak. Anybody have a question? And if we're just to think prepare that kind of question, and we have one question from the webinar watchers, and the question is like this to Professor Nye. In your idea of cooperative rivalry with China, how does U.S. view on India changed? Probably it is not only the China but also the Indian. You haven't mentioned that. And what is your ideas on China and India?
Well, I think you see an improvement in U.S.-Indian relations as a result of the more aggressive positions that China has taken. For example, in the recent period, there's been a border dispute in which Chinese border guards killed something like 20 Indian soldiers. And naturally, India then, instead of just looking the other way, says it would help us, India, if we work more closely with Japan and Australia and the US in the so-called Quad. India doesn't want an alliance with the United States, but it does want to be able to coordinate its behavior in a way to deter China from the reckless actions that China has taken. So I think from the point of view of the United States, we regard working with India, Japan, Australia in the Quad as important to shape the environment which China faces in its external behavior. That doesn't prevent us from still cooperating with China on areas where cooperation is necessary, like pandemics. But it does mean that of the cooperative rivalry, we can cooperate on pandemics at the same time that there's a rivalry about China's aggressive actions on the Indian border or in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, there's a question.
네, 좋은 말씀 감사히 잘
Thank
듣고
you very much for your insightful remarks.
저는 그 도덕성의 외교 정책의 성과와 한계
I would like to ask a question about the limitations in terms of means and consequences of moral view, particularly in terms of foreign policies. What are the limitations in terms of performance of this morality or moral-based foreign policies? Are there any good cases that you can offer to us or introduce to us where a good performance or good outcomes were generated out of a morality-based foreign policies of the U.S.?
Yes, I think that you can see the results. For example, I mentioned earlier the Marshall Plan, where America gave something like 4% of its gross domestic product to help the recovery of Europe. And that led to a favorable impression of the United States in Western Europe, which was very important in terms of the preventing the Soviet Union from taking over all of Europe during the Cold War. So I think that was an action which had a moral component, but it also had a self-interested component and had good consequences. But I'll give you another example, which is a more personal one. In 1978, I went with Secretary of State Vance. I was then in this Deputy Under Secretary of State Department. I went to Argentina, which was ruled by a military junta. And at that time, Jimmy Carter was promoting human rights. And the Argentine military didn't like the idea that we were talking to them about human rights. So our visit to Buenos Aires in 1978 was, we had quite a chilly reception. We were not received very well. I came back some years later when I was back as a professor at Harvard. I came back to Buenos Aires and I was treated very well as an American. I said, what's the difference? The last time I was here, Americans were very unpopular. Now Americans are very popular. And they said, the difference is the people whose fingernails were being pulled out in 1978 are now the people who are ruling the country. And we're very grateful to the Americans. So that's a personal example, nowhere near as dramatic as the Marshall Plan, but where a human rights policy had good long-term effects.
Quite interesting. Okay, we have another question from 이대리.
네, 말씀 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you for a very informative speech. I have two questions. They're very short. My first question would be, if Biden is to be elected as the president, then we may be able to see a restoration of the multilateral system. That's my perception. But if you look at WHO and other platforms of multilateralism, we have tested multilateralism, but the functions have been lost for a long time. What do you believe are the causes of such a situation? How can we improve the situation? What can we do to improve the situation? My second question has to do with Korea. Korea is located very close to China, and economically we are closely intertwined with China as well. So if you look at that, if you think about technology, economy, we have to coordinate with China when it comes to economic issues. But then again, we have a very strong relationship with the United States for the economic reasons and also for the security reasons. If you think about this dilemma that Korea is faced in right now, what would be your recommendations for Korea? What should we do?
Well, on the first question about multilateral institutions, yes, many multilateral institutions are weak because sovereign states are not willing to give them much power. And there have been many complaints about the World Health Organization in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, but those complaints, I think, have been exaggerated. There are things that can be done to improve the World Health Organization, and Dr. Tedros has talked about being willing to examine those. I think what we do is try to reform the organizations, not try to undercut them. In addition, many of the multilateral organizations can be supplemented by non-governmental organizations or quasi-governmental organizations. So the Alliance on Vaccines, Gavi, and another one, CEPI, are not formal intergovernmental organizations, but are supplements to the formal organization. And I was listening to a speech by an American epidemiologist today, and he said, you know, for all the problems that we have in these organizations, we scientists still communicate with each other, and every week we have a long call monitored and set up by the WHO, which helps us to compare notes and to share information. So I think there are problems with the multilateral institutions, but we would be much worse off without them. As for the situation of Korea, I always say, you know, if one were to look from 30,000 feet or from Mars or something and to look at Korea, you just say, here's poor Korea sandwiched in between much larger countries, China, which is a giant, and Japan, which is also larger than Korea. What's the right strategy for Korea? And the answer is go to a more distant giant and borrow its power, because it won't swallow you up. If you get too closely allied to the powers that are right next to you, then they'll have too much influence. If you borrow your power from a distant ally like the United States, you're not as likely to lose independence. So I think the solution for Korea is to maintain the alliance with the United States. It is a protection or an insurance policy you want. It doesn't mean you have to break economic relations with China. Quite the contrary. You want to prosper from the Chinese economy. But I would say don't give up your American alliance, because if the Chinese found that that you were dependent upon them in trade and defenseless militarily, then they would have much more influence in Seoul than they have now.
Okay, we have another question.
I have a question about the concept morality. Just previously you introduced that morality consists of 3 dimensions, that is intentions, means, and consequences. I'm particularly curious about how can we measure morality?
Well, it's a good question. What anthropologists and biologists have found is that there is a part of our brain which has evolved through decades, centuries of millennia of evolution, in which there's a concern for others. in which there is a moral concern. So you can show that when you put somebody in a brain monitoring device, you can show which parts of the brains which will light up when they're faced with a question about harming another person, for example. And that's true of virtually all humans. There are some that are physically damaged in the prefrontal cortex area of the brain that don't show this, but most of the rest of us do. What's different is that even though we all have that capacity for a moral sense, it's expressed in different ways in different cultures. So some cultures stress a principle of don't do harm to others. Other cultures put much more stress on taboos. These are certain things you should never do. You shouldn't eat certain foods, or you shouldn't dress in a certain way, and so forth. They still light up the same part of the brain, but each culture gives a different reason for why that part of the brain lights up. So in that sense, if you say, is there a universal morality? There is a moral capacity with almost all humans, but is there a single global culture so that it comes out the same way? The answer is no. So what may turn out to be moral in the culture, let's say, of Saudi Arabia, may not turn out to be moral in the culture of South Korea. So in that sense, when you say, can we measure morality, we can trace these neural networks which are triggered by moral situations, but we can't say that given different cultures, the same events will trigger that response the same way.
Okay, before wrapping up our dialogue and discussion, and let me add one or two questions. And one thing is that many people, we are just looking back the 20th century, 1930s, but before 1930s, the United States took the isolationist position and between European trade, and then we had the Great Depression, and then later there's two world wars. So this kind of pessimistic project we are just worrying about, and can our human society will repeat this kind of disastrous history, or you have optimistic we will not have that kind of thing again?
Well, it's a good question, and I wish I could assure you that it wouldn't happen again. The inward turning nature of the American people in the 1930s meant that they didn't stand up against Japanese aggression or against Hitler's aggression. And the net result was, of course, World War II and the genocide of the Jews, and it was very immoral consequences. So while the Americans in the 1930s, many of them who were isolationists, were saying, we're trying to stay away from problems, our intentions are good, but the consequences were terrible. And I think what's interesting is that after 1945, American political leaders learned that you cannot turn inward and neglect the rest of the world, because it can produce very immoral consequences. Many, or not many, but some people fear that what we're seeing in the United States today with the Trump administration is a repeat of the 1930s. The Trump is turning his back on alliances and international institutions and just saying America first without any attention to the long-term consequences. My own view is that is, and some people say that's a return to the 1930s. I think if you look at the public opinion polls, that's not the case. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs does a poll every 2 years asking Americans whether they want to have an outward-oriented foreign policy or an inward-oriented foreign policy. And in the last poll that was done a year or so ago. They're still about third and true for quite some time, but I don't think it's going to be the dominant theme of the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a very minor technical problem, but before another question, we have one more question from the floor. Yeah, please.
네, 감사합니다. 나이 교수님께서
Thank you very much. Professor Lai, you just mentioned that current President Donald Trump has the lowest score in terms of morality or moral values. But President Trump was elected by the U.S. citizens, and for the upcoming 2020 presidential election, there still is a chance that President Trump can be re-elected. So from the perspective of morality that you've mentioned, the U.S. citizens made a wrong choice by electing President Trump. So does it mean that the U.S. society or state is going to a wrong direction?
Well, that's an interesting question. Remember, Trump was elected in 2016 with a minority of the popular vote. In the American political system, a federal system, there is an electoral college which gives votes to each of the states. And Trump won the majority of the votes that were allocated to states. Each state gets a vote depending on its representation in the Congress and 2 votes for its representation in the Senate. And Trump managed to win in that electoral college, even though he lost the popular vote by more than 2%. What we see in the public opinion polls now, and it's still good 80 days or so before the election, is that Trump seems to be down about 10 percentage points on the popular vote. And he also, by most counts, is behind in the states that he would need to gain to win the election. American people in 2016 could be repeated. It looked like it will be repeated, but in a democracy, one never knows the outcome of an election until the votes are actually.
Okay, thank you. And before wrapping up, I'd like to.
So I think we're not.
Okay. There's a minor technical problem, so we haven't heard all of your answers. So can you just summarize very quickly?
Well, I think that it looks from the public opinion polls that Trump will not be reelected. So the mistake of 2016 is not likely to be repeated, but we don't know until the votes are counted.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And before wrapping up, and the final question, because both of us have taught in the university, but United States, one of the major 20th century success comes from the invitation of the foreign students, and then they work very well, perform very well in the Silicon Valley or something like that. But President Trump are reluctant to receive Chinese or some other Asian students in the United States. And how do you evaluate that? And what is the future of the university collaboration or students, just the exchange and that kind of thing for the prosperity and the good for United States and the world as a whole?
Well, the U.S. has benefited greatly from having foreign students. as Lee Kuan Yew once told me, we're able to draw upon the talents of the whole world, which is not something China can do. And in that sense, I think that after the Trump administration, we'll return to appreciating the importance of foreign students and foreign immigrants for our country.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I got an impression that your more foreign policy issue is very important for the future leaders in the United States as well as in other countries' leaders. And we have to think about the moral issues as well, not only the national interest alone. So it is a very impressive one. And just yet, we are running out of time and almost concluding our discussions. And could you please give us the concluding remarks of the discussion today?
Well, just to summarize, the cynical view that morals don't matter, that it's all just narrow interest, is mistaken. Morals can make a big difference in history, and morals are not the opposite of serving your own national interest. The moral issue comes not in whether you serve your national interest, but how you define your national interest. Do you define it broadly so that it incorporates the interests of others, or define it very narrowly? And I think what we're seeing right now in the United States is a period where we've had overly narrow definition of the national interest. But I hope that we're going to see in 2021 a return to the tradition since 1945, where we'll have a broad definition of national interest that includes allies and institutions.
Okay, thank you. And this has been a marvelous discussion, and we just like to thank Professor Nye. This kind of very interesting and very, very important issue that he raised, and many foreign policy and international relations scholars have been focused on the realism and the real politics or the national interest or something like that, but in disguise of the moral or something like that. But he emphasized the moral issues and then evaluated the 14 United States presidents, and then finds out. And moral issues are very important in many ways. It is good for the national interest as well. So in the 21st century, his idea for the world security and world peace, and not only the United States and China, just the G2 countries, but also other countries, including Korea, Japan, and something like that. And we have to focus on the moral issues. But another important point Professor Nye suggested, that is just a simple intention alone, motive alone, moral intention is not enough, and the means and consequences are more important. As he mentioned, that the president should be the educator for the people. So the consequences, educational consequence as well, a very important issue in terms of the leadership. The moral issues are very important. And in this sense, not only the political leaders, but also in the family and even in the society. And this kind of moral issues just reappear and comes up again. And then we solve the problems of the social conflict and social problems by way of moral issues. That is some kind of our underlying human sort of good points. And we have to develop this kind of issue for the 21st century. And one more question, the last question, and it is related to this issue. And sorry, the floor, do you have one more question? Oh, this one is the question that I got it. And because you are an educator in the university as well, so the direction of in the 21st century education goes in family and in schools, and not only in the university but also in the high school and junior high school, elementary schools, and how they changing. And do you have any advice for the educational issues for the 21st century? It is just a question from the floor, the last one.
Well, it's a very important question. I think one of the important roles for leaders, but also for teachers, is to broaden the horizons of their students, to see that there is a broader world out there with interests of other people. And I think if you look at the types of issues that are being placed on the agenda of world politics by ecological concerns, such as climate change or such as pandemics, you very rapidly see that you can't solve these by acting alone. And in that sense, we're going to have to teach students and others that they have to understand that there's power over others, getting others to do what you want, but there's also power with others, which is being able to do what you want because you can cooperate with others. And so I think for many of these new issues of the 21st century, we're going to have to educate our students and our publics to understand not just power over, but also power with others. And that's going to be a major task for us as teachers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, this is a very marvelous discussion. And also, I think that we have fortune to have Professor Nye, just like a great thinker, how to solve the problems in the 21st century, and especially in terms of the United States, U.S. Positions of the world leader, and how to reform just this kind of cooperative or the institutions to solve the world problems. Not only the pandemic issue or cybercrime or the climate issues, but also some kind of economic or the military problems as well. He has emphasized some kind of soft power rather than just like hard power, economic or military power. So I just expect that just like Professor Nye, the great thinkers, and they have some influence over the next president of the United States, and then the world society we will have the better world and a good future and perspective for our younger generation. And again, I would like to thank Professor Nye for your thoughts and time, especially the later day, just the hours, and good night for your time. And also thank you for our audiences. Thank you for joining us from the different part of the world. Have a great day and stay safe. And just hope to see you all again for the next global dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.